Over the last 18 episodes in this series, we've managed to rebuild an engine and a supercharger. Those were the two main parts, but there's still a lot left to do. Some of that is small stuff, like installing valve cover grommets so that we can run a PCV on the passenger side and a breather on the driver's side, along with an oil fill cap. But some of the work we have left is bigger stuff, like installing the harmonic balancer. In order to get that seated, we'll be using a threaded rod. In this case, it's a 1/2 inch by 20. We'll thread that in, drop a stack of washers over it, and install a coupler nut. The benefit of using one of these is twofold. We both get more thread engagement and have a longer hex for a socket to reach. Though it's not foolproof if somebody leaves the stud too long. But no matter, we'll switch to a pass-through ratchet and keep things moving. We'll also make sure the sealing surface of the balancer is thoroughly oiled. After a bit more tightening, the balancer bottoms out and is fully installed. We'll remove the threaded rod and change gears a little. We're going to go ahead and install the water pump now, because everything on the front of the engine fits pretty closely together and we should probably make sure that it all plays nice. We'll give the water pump and engine block coolant ports a light coat of RTV, following that up by dropping on gaskets and using 1 bolt per side to hold the water pump up against the block as we install the remaining 2. In some engines, these bolts go through into water passages, but on this particular one they are blind, and we just gave each of the bolts a light coating of anti-seize. And to finish things off, we will torque those to 30 foot-pounds. That's the water pump installed, and the front of the engine is really coming together. The rear cover bolts on the pump sit very close to the timing cover, but they're not actually touching, so that should be just fine. And fortunately, the same goes for the balancer. It's leaning in for the kiss, but it'll never quite make it there. At least the balancer is installed for good, right? Well, not quite. The only things keeping it from spinning on the crankshaft are friction and this little key. For serious blower setups, it's not uncommon to have a double-keyed crankshaft, but since nothing about this build is serious and we certainly don't need it, we're gonna go the cheap and kind of sketchy way of adding a round pin, just because I feel like it. We'll be drilling a hole and using a 1/4 inch reamer to get a dowel pin to fit in there nice and snug. To help us keep the drill bit on track and hopefully facing the right direction, we've got this drill bushing in a C size to match with our letter C drill bit. But in order for that bushing to do any good at all, we need a way to hold it still and in the right position. So, once again, we've got something to build. We'll start with a pencil rubbing of the 3 pulley mounting bolt holes at the front of the balancer, design a template based on those bolt locations, cut that out, transfer it to a piece of 3/8 inch 6061 aluminum, cut that out, this time using a saw instead of a pair of scissors, refine that a bit on the disc sander, really just for aesthetic reasons, center punch and use a 3/16 of an inch bit to pilot drill 5 holes into the plate, then step the center up to 1/2 inch and the outer 3 bolt locations to 25/64. And finally, we'll use a 7/16 of an inch bit to make the hole for the bushing, which I definitely got in the right place on the first try. The bushing is an okay fit, but maybe I should have used a reamer for that too. It can be moved around a little bit, and to help hold it still, we will add a locking screw. And with the bushing held down, it's time to give this thing a whirl. We'll attach that to the balancer by starting the 3 outer bolts, using the install stud to make sure our plate is centered, and then tightening the bolts down. With that securely fastened, we'll remove the install tool and we can peep down the bushing to see that we are aimed directly between the harmonic balancer and the crank snout. We'll go ahead and take a depth measurement and add 1.05 inches on top of that, so we'll be drilling just over an inch. We'll do our best to keep the drill bit oiled, both for the drilling itself as well as it spinning around in the bushing. Pretty soon we're all the way down to our marking tape, which means we should be at the correct depth. So out come the 3 bolts, and off comes our guide plate. There's quite a pile of shavings in there, but once we brush that away, it appears that we're in good shape. We'll try to vacuum up anything that's left and switch to the 1/4 inch reamer. This will also get plenty of oil, but as it's only removing a tiny amount of material, was a very quick and easy process. The dowel pin hole comes in at a central depth of 1.15 inches, which should be just about perfect. At this point, we could have just installed the pin and called it a day, but I kinda wanted to see the results of all that work. So we'll install a puller and impact the balancer back off. With that removed, we can take a good look at our results. The location seems pretty spot on, but the alignment is just a bit off. Functionally, it's not going to make any difference at all, and we can be quite confident, as if we couldn't have before, that the harmonic balancer is not going to spin on the crankshaft. So we can go ahead and install it for good this time. A small but important detail that I missed in the Blazer engine rebuild series years ago was putting a little dab of RTV to fill the crankshaft keyway and make sure oil can't seep out past it. Missing this wouldn't cause big problems, but it is definitely worth doing. To pull the balancer on, we'll be using the same install stud, though this time we'll space it out a bit so that the impact gun can drive the balancer all the way. And with the installer removed, we only need a pin to finish off this modification. This dull 1/4 inch drill bit should work nicely, so we'll cut that roughly to length and then use the sander to dial it in. Pretty soon, that's measuring 1.35 inches in length, and it's ready for a test fit. With the pin bottomed out, it's extending 0.21 inches, which is right where I wanted it to be. This extra bit of stick out will minimize the amount of space it has behind the pulley register to move around. To get ready to install that pulley, we'll anti-seize the inner edge of the balancer and pop it into place. This is an aluminum 2-groove supercharger pulley. It's a generic aftermarket one with a register on the front and 6 threaded bolt holes for installing standard Gilmer drive pulleys. The 3 thread-locked socket cap screws will get torqued to 30 foot-pounds. With those taken care of, only the center bolt remains. This is a 1/2 inch by 20, which we will slather with far too much thread locker and torque to 85 foot-pounds. Unsurprisingly, and thankfully, since if it didn't, something would definitely be wrong, the crank starts turning before that bolt is tight. To hold it still, we'll thread in one of the flex plate bolts and jam a pry bar between that, the rear crank register, and the engine stand. That does the trick and gets us our click. One last little detail that I almost forgot was painting the timing notch on the balancer. With that made much more visible, and now that we have our first V-belt pulley on the engine, we can start figuring out our engine accessories. First up, we're gonna need an alternator. I didn't choose anything fancy. This is a pretty generic remanufactured 12SI alternator rated for 78 amps. We certainly could have reused the alternator that's already on the car, but it's only good for something like 40 amps, and when the turn signals were on, you could see all the lights in the car dim. It never actually caused problems with the electric fans installed on the car, but it would probably be a good idea to have a little bit more juice. For us to mount that to our engine, we're gonna need a bracket, which is where this cheap set from Speedmaster comes in. Both of the mounting holes are drilled for a 3/8 of an inch bolt, but the lower is supposed to be a 7/16. We'll drill that out to fit, and take the assembled bracket over to the engine to bolt it on, hoping that there won't be any other issues. This is a sort of mid-level alternator mount, which will hopefully clear our supercharger idler and the inner fenders and everything else, but we'll just have to wait and see. With the alternator bolts loosely installed, it moves freely, and it seems like we have pretty close to a full range of movement. Since everything seems to be fitting, we'll torque the upper 3/8 of an inch bracket bolt to 30 foot-pounds and the lower 7/16 inch bracket bolt to 40. So it's on there, but we're still left with a problem. The connector for the alternator is facing the engine block and will pretty much butt up against the headers. That is non-ideal, but luckily these alternators are clockable, so we can adjust that positioning. The first thing we'll do is make sure the brush doesn't pop out of place by installing a bent paperclip into the rear of the housing at this convenient little opening. Now we can remove the 4 housing bolts, and by pulling the rear of the housing backwards just a little bit, we are able to rotate it. In this case, to clear our bracket, we'll have to pull it a little bit farther back, but that paperclip will make sure everything stays where it needs to be. And with the connector terminals facing upwards, just where we want them, we can reinstall and snug down the 4 housing bolts. The paperclip can come out to release the brush, and I don't have any kind of torque spec for these bolts, so we'll just get them nice and tight. And there we have it. Our alternator is installed and should be ready to go. It will be sharing an accessory belt with the water pump, so let's install that pulley and see how everything fits. This is a generic big block Chevy style aluminum pulley, which we will hold down with 4 5/16 by 24 countersunk cap screws. We'll get those tight enough for now, and see if we can figure out what length belt we're going to need. We'll do that by wrapping a piece of rope around the pulleys and measuring its length. With the alternator all the way inward, we're looking at 47 inches, and 49 with it all the way out. We're probably looking at a 49-inch belt here. But what about the pulley alignment? Well, it's pretty clear that both the alternator and water pump line up with the rear groove on the crank pulley. So the general layout will work, but we'll end up spacing all 3 pulleys forward a bit to make them line up as well as possible. To get the alternator where we want it, we'll remove the mount from the block and bolt it back on with 1/16 of an inch washers underneath the spacers. We'll go ahead and remove the bolts to pull the water pump pulley back off, making some discoveries in the process. Ooh, pretty sharp. I don't know how I know. Once it's been removed, we can fit a standard 1/16 of an inch shim beneath the pulley, or at least we could if it fit. To reduce the outer diameter of the shim, we'll use the power drill and belt sander in combination, and pretty soon it fits like it should. We'll step up to some longer 3/4 of an inch screws and install the pulley with that 1/16 of an inch spacer behind it. Those screws will get torqued to 20 foot-pounds. After my previous encounter with it, I was a little bit weary of holding the pulley still while tightening those down, so I ended up using a pry bar wrapped in a rag. That did work to hold it still, but also left a ding in the side of the pulley, so perhaps it's not ideal. We gave both of those accessories a 1/16 of an inch boost, so why are we about to put an 1/8 inch spacer on the crank pulley? It'll give us a bit of wiggle room for adjustment in the future, and nobody local had any big block Chevy spacers at all, so my impatience won out and I stole the 1/8 inch spacer off of the small block that's currently in the Firebird, only then realized I didn't have the right size hole saw to resize the center for the big block, and got creative with the rotozip, drill press, and file to eventually resize it. Sure, it was a lot of labor, we should have just made one from scratch, and I broke a couple of rotozip bits in the process, but at least we have a spacer that will work. The addition of the spacer does mean the dowel pin has a little bit more theoretical movement space, but I decided to just cut out some foam discs and fill that in to make sure it's not rattling around. With the pulley back in place, we'll install the 3 outer bolts, although this time we're using slightly longer ones because I felt like the thread engagement was just a little bit on the short side. Once again, those will get torqued to 30 foot-pounds. Those bolts are definitely as long as they possibly could be. They stick a little bit out of the back of the balancer, but they're not going to run into anything, so that'll be fine. And once the center bolt has been torqued back down to 85 foot-pounds, we are finally ready to recheck the pulley alignment. And now it seems like we're in really good shape. But, of course, we still have one more accessory to consider. That would be the power steering pump. Again, we could have used the one that was already on the car, but this one will be shiny and nice and easier to paint. To hold it up, we have just about the cheapest bracket I could find. This is supposed to be a driver's side mid-mount. Once we had a configuration that made sense, we'll take it over to the engine and see if we can assemble it. The lower frame of the bracket is held to the block with two 7/16 of an inch bolts, and attaches to the pump with two 3/8 of an inch bolts. That rear lower one is supposed to be a stud, but for test fitting purposes we're just using a bolt in its place. And from there we can attach the last piece that came with the mount set using two more 3/8 bolts. And with it assembled, we can see how it's supposed to work. We've got a nice pivot point down at the bottom, but there seems to be something missing. Yeah, the slot bolt has absolutely nothing to attach to. This was an oversight on my part back when I ordered the water pump. It didn't even occur to me that this aluminum pump didn't have a bolt boss that's typically used for these power steering pump mounts. It's not totally the end of the world, we can make one if we have to, but how about the pulley alignment? Well, unfortunately, if we try to use this pulley that we sandblasted and painted, we are off by a full groove on the crank pulley. We can push the power steering pump back a bit more by removing the spacers behind the mount, so we'll see how that looks. And it's a little hard to say while just eyeballing it without the pulley installed, but it doesn't look like it's gonna work. At least, not with this pulley. We'll order another one and come back to that, but right now we need to focus on fully mounting the pump. We'll start with a spare water pump gasket and use it to mark the bolt hole locations onto this piece of cardboard. From there, I'll use all my CAD skills to mark out, cut out, and design a bracket. For the final test fit, we'll pull out the two driver side water pump mounting bolts and use them to secure our template. This lets us take the measurements we're going to need and even test fit it with a bolt. With our design pretty much finalized, we'll transfer it to a tidier cardstock template and transfer that to a piece of 1/4 inch plate steel. The main reason for that material choice is that it would let us weld a nut to the back side of the bracket, which would make the power steering belt tension nice and easy to adjust. Once the angle grinder's work is finished, we can hammer back and forth on this last awkward piece until it breaks off. That gives us the general shape, and from there we can pilot drill the 3 bolt holes we're going to need, before sizing up the 2 water pump side mounting bolts to 3/8 of an inch and the power steering pump bolt hole to 1/2 an inch. We'll chamfer all those edges and head to the belt sander to do the final shaping of the bracket. With all that smoothed out, we're left with a much more refined shape, and the last thing we need to do is weld on the nut. That'll need another cleanup pass, but at least it is all together. Back at the engine, there's one last thing we need to figure out, and that's a spacer to go between the power steering pump mount and the bracket we just made. In a bit of a stroke of luck, this piece was laying around, a leftover from the idler set we bought for the supercharger. This was a standoff that we didn't need. And it just so happens that that first shoulder on this standoff is just the right length. So with another aluminum cutting disc on the angle grinder, we'll take the end of that off and flatten out the cut on the disc sander. That leaves us with this 1.5 inch spacer that should work just perfectly. Now that we should have all the parts we're going to need, we can bolt that bracket to the engine and drop our spacer in place using a 1/2 inch bolt to finally secure the power steering pump. It's a little bit of a tight fit which could use some fine tuning, but for now I'm counting it as a success. But to make sure any of this is going to work, we'll need to install a pulley onto the pump. I couldn't find a whole lot of options, but this double groove pulley, while maybe a bit unsightly since we're only going to be using one groove, seems like it should be just the right depth. And those pass-through ports in the pulley should come in handy for tightening the pump down to its mounts. But before installing that, we'll pull the pump off, sand it down a bit, clean it off, tape it up, and paint it with the same cast coat aluminum silver as the rest of the engine. Once it's had enough time to dry and cure, we'll use a pulley installer to press the pulley onto the pump shaft. We'll get it started by clamping the install stud in the vise and tightening down the nut. Once it was clear the pulley was going on straight, we'll use the impact to drive it the rest of the way on. And once the front of the pulley is flush with the end of the shaft, we are good to go. It's finally time to install the mounts for real. Our adjuster bracket was also painted to match, and we'll install that, torquing the bolts back down to 30 foot-pounds. The pump can be dropped back onto the lower bracket, and we'll reinstall the upper. Finally, back on goes the spacer and adjustment bolt. And now that the whole thing's held still, we'll go ahead and torque the upper mounting bolts to 30 foot-pounds. With that in place, we can check our alignment, and it's clearly going to need a little bit of work. For each of the bolts, between the lower mount and the block, we'll place a 1/16 of an inch and 1/8 of an inch washer. And we'll place 1/8 of an inch washers between our adjustment bolt bracket and the water pump. Those bolts will once again see 30 foot-pounds, and we'll take the two lower mount bolts to 40. We can even test fit a belt, and it seems like it clears everything just fine. Hopefully we're done messing with these accessories. A final touch for the power steering pump is removing the plug that it shipped with and installing a proper cap. We'll continue working and problem solving until this engine is fully together and ready to go in the car, which isn't going to happen in the next episode, but we're getting closer and closer.
This washer is a little bit worse for wear.